If you want my honest opinion, the greatest financial trick of the last half-century was not a stock market crash. It was an education, or rather the lack of one. Most people were not robbed because somebody picked their pocket in a dark alley. They were robbed because they were taught a money language that stopped being true, and nobody bothered to tell them the grammar had changed. That is a very expensive thing to miss. I have spent most of my life around capital, balance sheets, markets, businesses, and the repeated habits that separate people who merely earn money from people who actually build wealth. And the older I get, the less interested I become in emotional slogans about money. Work hard, save, buy a house, trust the experts, fund the retirement account, diversify. Wait, hope, that is the catechism millions were given. It sounds responsible. It is also incomplete enough to keep a great many good people financially obedient and permanently confused. I do not use the word conspiracy lightly. Most of the time, what people call a conspiracy is just incentives doing exactly what incentives do. The banks do not need to meet in a secret room and decide to keep you financially weak. The school system does not need to announce that it will avoid teaching what matters. The retirement industry does not need to admit openly that confusion is profitable. The system only needs one thing. It needs you to remain financially literate enough to earn, borrow, save, and comply. But not financially literate enough to question the architecture itself. That is enough. That is how the game works. And if you want to understand when the game really changed, you must go back to a year most people have heard and almost nobody has truly studied. 1971, I remember very clearly how people talk about turning points after they have already happened. They make them sound inevitable. They make them sound clean. They make them sound as if everyone should have instantly understood what had just changed. Real turning points do not feel that way. They arrive quietly, they feel technical. Then decades later, you realize the entire financial landscape was split in 2-by-1 decision. Almost nobody around the kitchen table understood at the time. In 1971, President Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Now, before you dismiss that as old macroeconomic trivia, slow down. That decision matters to your checking account, your retirement account, your mortgage, your savings habits, and the way inflation has treated your life for decades before that shift. The dollar was at least tied, however, imperfectly to something tangible. Afterward, the dollar became pure fiat currency. That phrase sounds academic. But the practical meaning is simple. The money itself stopped being anchored to something scarce and became something that could be expanded by policy and political necessity. People kept calling it money. In reality, it had become something closer to managed currency. And managed currency behaves very differently over long stretches than people raised on old financial morality tend to assume. A currency can be multiplied. A currency can be diluted. A currency can remain numerically stable in your account while the life it can purchase steadily shrinks. That is what most people never learned. They kept using the word money as though it still meant what their grandparents thought it meant. It did not. And once you misunderstand the nature of the unit itself, every downstream financial decision becomes more vulnerable to error. This is why I say ignorance was the real event. Not 2008, not the housing collapse, not the rating fraud. Those were later consequences. The seed was planted much earlier when the country shifted from one type of monetary reality to another, and ordinary people continued receiving financial advice built for a world that no longer existed. That is how good, hardworking people get hurt, not because they refuse effort, because they follow rules whose underlying assumptions have expired. Now, what happened after 1971? Credit exploded. This is what always happens when money loses its old discipline and enters a more elastic regime. The economy looked more energetic. Credit became easier. Consumer finance spread. Debt became more socially normal. Homes started being viewed less as shelter and more as balance sheet extensions. People borrowed against future income and later against home equity with a confidence that would have looked insane in other eras but felt perfectly modern in the new one. The whole culture began mistaking access to credit for evidence of wealth. That is one of the oldest confusions in capitalism. A man becomes able to borrow and feels richer. He becomes able to finance and feels more successful. He becomes able to carry a larger payment and thinks his life has advanced. Sometimes it has Very often it has simply become more leverage to the same machine. This is where I need to slow down, because the difference between currency and money is not merely theoretical. Money, in the old intuitive sense people still carry inside them, suggests stored effort that remains relatively intact. Currency in the modern practical sense is much more like a flow system. It moves, it inflates, it changes value over time. It rewards some structures and punishes others. If you spend your whole life behaving as if cash accumulation alone is the final wisdom, you may discover too late that you preserved units and lost purchasing power. That is what millions did. They saved responsibly, they deposited faithfully, they trusted institutions, and all the while the system around them was rewarding borrowers of the right kind, owners of the right kind, and punishing passive savers who mistook numerical stability for actual financial safety. This is where the next turning point becomes important, 2008. Now, people remember 2008 as a housing crash, a banking panic, or a recession. All of that is true. I think of it more simply. It was the moment the public briefly saw how the machine really behaves, when complexity, leverage, and widespread ignorance are allowed to cooperate. The banks did not stumble into that crisis blindly. They built enormous fee machines around mortgages, risk packaging, rating arbitrage, and public trust. People who should never have received certain loans received them anyway. Those loans were pooled, sliced, labeled, marketed, and sold upward through the system with a language of sophistication that made them sound safer than they were. This is another recurring feature of bad finance. Complexity is often sold as expertise when it is really camouflage. Subprime mortgages were not safe because they were placed inside prettier containers. Bad loans do not become good because they acquire a better wardrobe, and yet the entire structure depended on enough people not understanding that fact at the same time. Investors trusted ratings. Retirement systems trusted the wrappers. Institutions trusted the machinery. Ordinary families trusted the banks. And the banks themselves trusted that the public did not understand enough to ask the right questions until it was too late. That is how fraud scales, not only through lying, through asymmetry of understanding. If the seller knows the real quality of the product and the buyer cannot easily evaluate it, the profit opportunity becomes enormous. This is what made 2008 so destructive. Not merely the mortgages, the fact that the entire structure rested on the public, not understanding the structure. Then it broke. Homes collapsed in value. Jobs vanished. Retirement accounts were cut brutally. People who had followed every respectable instruction suddenly discovered that respectable instructions do not protect you when the system underneath them is built on fragile incentives. And then came the final insult. The institutions most responsible for the mess were stabilized with public support, while the households least able to bear the damage were told, in effect, that this was just what unfortunate markets sometimes do. That is, when many people became angry, they should have become educated. Anger alone does not repair a financial life. Understanding can. This is why I am not interested in leaving the story at outrage. I want the actual lesson. The actual lesson is that financial ignorance is not merely a personal weakness. It is a profitable condition for other people. If you do not understand what an asset is, someone can sell you liabilities wearing asset language. If you do not understand credit, someone can sell you leverage as progress. If you do not understand inflation, someone can tell you saving is always safety. If you do not understand tax structure, someone can sell you retirement products without explaining the full cost of the rules attached to them. And if you do not understand how institutions are paid, you may mistake a sales process for objective advice. That is the real issue, not villains in capes, incentives in suits. Now we arrive at one of the most abused concepts in personal finance: assets and liabilities. People make this more mystical than it needs to be. I prefer clean definitions. An asset puts money into your pocket or grows in a way that meaningfully strengthens your position. A liability takes money out of your pocket. That is the operational distinction, not the emotional distinction. Not the social distinction, not what your neighbor calls it, what it does. This is where ordinary people get trapped because they use social language to evaluate financial objects. The house is called an asset, the car is called an asset, the education debt is called an investment in yourself. The upgraded lifestyle is called success. Very often those labels conceal rather than reveal. Your primary residence may become valuable over time. Fine, it may still function operationally as a heavy outflow while you live in it. Mortgage taxes, insurance, repairs, maintenance, furnishing, utilities, opportunity cost. That does not mean homeownership is automatically foolish. It means calling the thing an asset without examining what it does to your cash flow is lazy thinking. A rental property that throws off cash after real expenses is a very different thing from a family home whose main economic contribution is to keep asking for more money. The same applies to vehicles. A truck used to generate business income is one thing. A luxury SUV financed to support an image is another. The problem is not the object. The problem is what the object does to your future. This is why I always say the wealthy are not mainly separated from everyone else by account size at first. They are separated by interpretation. They interpret financial objects more honestly. The average person asks, "What can I afford monthly?" The investor asks, "What does this object do to my cash flow, optionality, and future capital?" That difference looks tiny on paper. It is enormous in life. The employee mindset and the investor mindset begin diverging right there. The employee mindset centers labor. I work, I get paid. I spend, I save some. I repeat, the investor mindset centers control. What do I own? What is producing? What is consuming? What can be shifted? What can be scaled? What can work while I sleep? What deserves more capital? That is a very different operating system. It does not make a person morally superior. It makes him structurally stronger. And structure is what decides who panics when the world gets noisy. Now let us talk about the 401k. Because this is where millions of decent people were sold a partial solution and taught to call it a complete one. For much of the 20th century, many workers expected retirement through pensions or versions of them. Then the burden shifted. More responsibility was pushed onto the individual worker. The defined contribution era expanded. The worker became responsible not only for earning, but for becoming a competent long-term allocator. Fine. In theory, that could have been empowering. In practice, millions were handed the responsibility without the education. Save inside the account. Choose from the menu. Hope the market behaves. Trust the default options. Wait until old age. That was close enough to the full story that most people did not ask what was missing. What was missing was education about taxes, inflation, fees, behavior, sequence risk, liquidity, and the fact that deferring tax is not the same thing as escaping tax. The account itself is not evil. Far from it, tax-advantaged compounding can be useful, but an entire generation was encouraged to believe that feeding the account alone was the same thing as mastering money. It is not. A retirement account is a container, not wisdom. A person can max out contributions and still be financially illiterate in every way that matters the most when pressure arrives. That is another reason people feel betrayed later. They followed the approved ritual and assumed the ritual itself would protect them. Ritual does not protect, understanding does. Then there is saving. Now here is where many people become upset because they have been taught since childhood that saving money is automatically virtuous and beyond criticism. I have no quarrel with discipline. I do have a quarrel with worshiping cash as though it were the final destination of capital. Cash is a reserve. Cash is optionality. Cash is useful for near-term obligations and emotional stability. Cash is not the highest destiny of a working lifetime if it is left idle while inflation reduces its real power. Year after year, this is where people become confused. They hear that saving is losing and immediately think one must therefore become reckless, fully invested at all times, allergic to liquidity, and intoxicated with risk number. That is childish. I am saying something narrower and more important. If your whole strategy is to work hard, accumulate cash, leave it underpaying in institutions that themselves redeploy it more profitably, and hope that numerical preservation equals financial advancement, then you are almost certainly making your life easier for banks than for yourself. This is what the informed wealthy understand. Cash should have a purpose. Emergency reserve, opportunity reserve, operating reserve, tax reserve, near-term known need. Beyond that, capital should be deployed according to a clear logic toward productive ownership, not left permanently as a quiet victim of the monetary environment. That is the language of allocation. It is the language ordinary households were almost never taught. This is why I do not blame the public for being confused. I blame the educational vacuum. A person can become a doctor, lawyer, engineer, teacher, manager, skilled tradesman, nurse, designer, or executive, and still receive almost no meaningful education about what money is, what debt does, what inflation destroys, what assets actually are, how taxes shape outcomes, or how incentives distort so-called advice. That is not an accident in the poetic sense. It is simply a condition under which many institutions continue prospering. Confused savers are profitable. Confused borrowers are profitable. Confused investors are profitable. The system does not need everyone to stay ignorant. It only needs enough ignorance to keep the flows moving. Now, what should a sane adult do once he sees this? First, stop treating your financial life like an honor code. Stop asking what feels virtuous and start asking what is structurally sound. Second, distinguish between reserve cash and dead cash. Reserve cash protects, dead cash decays. Third, stop calling every large purchase an asset just because the culture taught you that word. Name it by what it does. Fourth, learn the incentives of every institution that touches your money. Bank, broker, advisor, plan provider, lender, insurance company. You do not have to become paranoid. You do need to become realistic. Fifth, move from employee questions toward investor questions. Not how secure is my job? How many streams of control exist beyond my job? Not what can I afford? What can I own that changes the future? Not how high is my salary? How much of what I earn becomes deployed toward durable assets, rather than disappearing into maintenance of a life that only looks prosperous. That is the transition. And once that transition begins, the whole story changes. The person no longer experiences money only as pressure. He begins experiencing it as structure. At first, the structure is small: a reserve, a debt cleanup plan, an automatic index contribution, a rental property, a small business, a better understanding of taxes, a more honest budget, a refusal to finance image. Then, if the person persists, the structure becomes something stronger. The money begins doing some of the work. Then later, much more of it. This is what most people envy when they look at the rich and say the system is rigged. Often they are partly right, but they stop too early. The question is not whether the system is unfair. The question is whether you can still learn the real rules well enough to stop playing the losing role. Usually you can. It may take time. It may require embarrassment. It may require living more plainly than your peer group for a while. It may require saying no to liabilities that flatter the ego and yes to assets that flatter no one until years later. Fine, that is how adult wealth is built, not by applause, by reclassification, by seeing more clearly than you used to. This is the part that matters most to me. Once you understand the difference between currency and money, between assets and liabilities, between working for money and having money work for you, between employee obedience and investor structure, you cannot go back honestly. You can still choose comfort over change, plenty do, but you cannot pretend you do not see the mechanism anymore. That is why real education is dangerous to systems built on confusion. A truly educated saver becomes a selective depositor. A truly educated borrower becomes a cautious user of leverage instead of a helpless consumer of it. A truly educated worker starts looking for ownership. A truly educated retiree understands the difference between a tax wrapper and actual safety. A truly educated household stops mistaking surface prosperity for real progress. That is the only conspiracy language I respect, not shadowy men in rooms. A public taught just enough to participate and not enough to question. The answer is not rage. It is literacy, financial literacy, but not the decorative kind. not balancing a checkbook, not memorizing vocabulary for cocktail parties, real literacy. How the system prices your ignorance, how inflation taxes your passivity, how debt can shrink or scale you, how assets actually behave, how containers differ from strategy, how to think like an owner, that is where freedom begins. Not in the bank account first, in the mind. Because once the mind changes, the account often follows. And if the mind never changes, even a larger account can still sit on top of the same old confusion. I have seen people with high incomes live poor mental lives because every dollar still flows through employee logic and consumer interpretation. I have seen more modest earners build surprising strength because they began asking investor questions early enough and consistently enough. That is the divide. Not rich versus poor in the theatrical sense, clear versus confused, owner versus participant, allocator versus earner only. That is the line I care about. If you are still only working for money, then money remains your boss in a different suit. If some of your money now works for you, then something profound has changed. You may still have a job, you may still have debts, taxes, obligations, and all the rest of ordinary life. But the direction has changed, and when the direction changes, the compounding starts. That is what I would want you to see. If you ask me what the rich teach their children that the system does not teach most people, not magic, not greed, not secret handshakes, they teach interpretation, they teach the difference between owning and owing, they teach the cost of ignorance, they teach what cash is for and what it is not for, they teach what debt should buy and what it should never buy, they teach that institutions have incentives, they teach that a paycheck is important but incomplete, and they teach sometimes clumsily and sometimes brilliantly. That wealth is less about how much you make than about what your money is commanded to do once you make it. That is not mystical. It is simply the truth. And once you see it, you stop asking whether the system is fair and start asking how to stop volunteering for the losing side of it. That is a much better question. It is also the beginning of a much better life.